Imagine if you could share little tidbits of information throughout your application. Well, there was a new feature added in Laravel called Context. And with Context, you can share information among requests, commands, and jobs. Using Context is simple. Let's talk about a couple basic scenarios and basic ways of using context. Simply put, we can put and get stuff from the context. So let's take a look at that. First, if you wanted to put something into the context, we just use the context facade and we just say add, and then we specify a key. So let's say the key is, something to do with the user, and we want to set the email, and we're going to hard code it to Nick. So that's how you would set it. And the basic for getting is context and get. And we just say we want to get the user. And now that's how you can add and get kind of stuff. Those are two very simple ways of using context, but I think what would make more sense is if we talk about how we would apply this in perhaps a real world application. So if we're going to use this in a real world application, a couple of the use cases might be that you want to add to the user to everything that you're logging. Well, in this case, if we do the context add early on in a middleware, anytime you log something, Laravel is going to automatically grab the items from context and then put them in the log file for you. So it's extremely convenient and will make your life easy for debugging. I created a whole nother video on adding a request ID to all requests coming into your application. I highly recommend checking that out if you're interested in learning more about that and traceability. So let's talk about a few real world scenarios where we might want to use this. First, we're going to start with the example that Laravel gives in the documentation. So let's open up our app service provider. The example that they use is the DB listen event, and they're adding all of the database queries that our application's making. Perhaps we wanted to add those to the logs or do something with those. In order to listen to all of the database queries, we can use the database facade or the DB facade. So DB listen, and this takes a closure, which has an event as a parameter. And so we can add then the context. So in this case, we're not going to use add, we're going to use push, because anytime you add the same key twice, it's going to override that existing key. But in our case, we want every single query that's running. So we're going to say context push, and the key that we're going to use is queries. And then we can say event SQL, and that comes from the DB listen right here, providing this event parameter. So we're going to use the default Laravel index route. So let's open up web. And in here, we need to make a few database calls, and then let's test this out on a log message. So if we say user all, that's going to run a query to get all the users, and then let's just say user first. And then we're going to add a log message, and we're going to say, does this show the queries? And if all works and goes according to plan, we're going to look at the log message, and it's going to include the two queries that were ran here. I'm going to refresh the default Laravel page, and let's check out the log file. Okay, so we can see our log message. It does say does this show the queries? And then what we can also see is that there's a JSON, and this is the context that's automatically provided to every single log message. So to add a little bit more to this, if we go back to web and instead we move this log message and we say, does this show the all query? And then if we add another log message underneath that says, this should show all. The first one should only show this first query, and the second one should show any and all queries that happen. Let's refresh the page. and go back to the log. So now we can see the difference between the two because this one is showing all of them and this one was only showing the queries up until that point. So before we move on to our next scenario, I would definitely say caution when using context because this could definitely be overused. And so in the case of this query, for example, we have, just a simple example where we're listing out all the queries. But if you could imagine a large application that's running 10, 20, 30 queries, we might not want all of that information included on every single log message. You could potentially take a performance hit. So maybe something like this in your app service provider, this might be hidden behind a environment variable or some kind of feature flag so that in local development, maybe this happens, but in your dev stage or production environments, this isn't necessarily running. So that's definitely something to consider because I could see this context stuff being overused in many places. So you want to keep an eye on that. The next potential real world scenario to kind of get your wheels turning to hopefully think about how you can potentially use this in your application is, let's say you've got multiple accounts or you allow multiple accounts in your application and the user might need to switch between those multiple accounts, or there's some sort of like multiple or multi-tenant aspect to this. So let's add in whatever account is currently selected into the context. So that way, when it's being used throughout the application, that information is maintained. Now, I wouldn't say that this is necessarily the only way of doing this, but this is just one way to do this. So let's use the default route. And when the account request query parameter is added, we're going to use that account and add that into the context so that can further be used in logging, in jobs, etc. So let's declare a variable called account. And then let's just use the request helper function. And we're going to say input an account. And we're going to provide a default. So for example, let's say somebody is just coming to your application. They haven't yet selected an account, but perhaps they might have a default account out of the 3 accounts that are on your application. We're just going to say that's, the number 1 and then use that variable. So what we can do now is we're just going to do context add and then selected account. And then we're just going to provide that account. So again, it's important to understand that the add method will override the selected account every single time. So if there was something in there previously, it's going to override it with whatever value it is that you're adding. And so likewise, anytime you dispatch a job or whatever, it's that contextual information is going to be present. So to prove that, we're going to do log info, and then let's just say this is the default route from Laravel, and we're not providing any contextual information. It is possible to provide, more context if you wanted to, but we're not going to do that because we want to show that this context, is being added automatically by Laravel. And so let's go back to Chrome, refresh the page, and go back to the log. So we can see this is the default from Laravel. And we still had our queries in there, and the queries were running. But we also see this other thing called selected account. And the selected account is exactly the value that we defaulted it to because that wasn't included in the request. However, now, if we say account equals 123 and go to that, go back to this, and now we can see that we do indeed have this account called 123 that's automatically added into our log messages. So now that we've kind of set that account in the context, what we can do now is we can get that. So in order to get that and use it, Laravel provides another function called has if you wanted to check to see if something exists perhaps before you use it, or we can just use the get. So context get selected account, and we're just going to DD it just to show it. And there it is. There's the 1, 2, 3. Highly recommend visiting the docs on this one because there are a ton more features. We just barely scratched the surface. I wanted to kind of get your wheels turning and to see how you could potentially implement this in your application. There are things like conditionally adding stuff to the context given a closure. There are functions to add stuff into the context but hidden, so that way when you do log stuff, is not included, so that might be semi-sensitive information. And there are a whole bunch more. Look at the documentation. They do a really good job on the doc. I hope you found this video useful and kind of got you thinking about how you can use this in your application. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe as it helps my channel immensely.